They told us it was a diplomatic mission. That was the first lie, and it set the tone for everything that followed. I've had years to think about it now, years of debriefs, psych evaluations, 3 separate inquiries by the Colonial Affairs Directorate, and 1 closed-door session with people who never gave me their names. In all of that time, across all of those tables and all of those carefully worded questions, nobody ever apologized for the lie. They just kept asking me to repeat what happened on Vethara IV, as if some new telling would shake loose a detail that changed the math. It never did. The math was always the same. 9 of us went in, 1 came out. My name is Dex Schiefer. At the time I held the rank of Sergeant Major in the 14th Combat Engineers, Colonial Defense Force. I want to be precise about that, because what the Directorate's report calls our team in its declassified summary, a technical advisory contingent, is a phrase that would have gotten a man's jaw broken in the unit I served in. We were soldiers. Every one of us had bled for the CDF on at least 2 separate worlds. We weren't advisors. We were the people command sent when they wanted something done quietly and completely, and they didn't want to account for how it got done. The mission brief we received on the transit shuttle said we were being inserted to recover a crashed diplomatic courier vessel near the Vethara IV staging zone. The accord negotiations with the Varath Dominion had been running for 11 months. Someone wanted those negotiations to succeed badly enough that they'd authorized an insertion into contested moon territory to pull the courier's data cores before the Varath got to them. Simple recovery. In and out before local dawn. Dillon gave us that brief. Operative Second Class Marcus Dillon, Colonial Intelligence, wearing a uniform he'd clearly borrowed from someone taller. He had the practiced ease of a man accustomed to telling soldiers things they needed to hear rather than things that were true. I'd served with him before, years back, and I'd learned to read the tells, the slight over-precision of his diction, the way his eyes moved to the shuttle window whenever he said the word straightforward. On the shuttle to Vethara IV, he said straightforward 4 times. I let it go. The mission was the mission. Vethara IV was what the survey teams called a Class C jungle moon, breathable atmosphere, dense canopy, magnetic interference that made orbital scanning unreliable below 500 meters. The Varath Dominion had been using it as a staging area and hunting preserve for decades before humanity arrived in the system. That was the other thing nobody mentioned in the brief. The Varath didn't just live on the moons they claimed. They hunted on them. The dense canopy, the magnetic noise, the restricted sight lines, those weren't environmental inconveniences. They were features. We dropped in 2 clicks south of the courier's last telemetry ping, in a clearing barely wide enough for the insertion pod. The moment the hatch opened, I felt the place settle onto me like a wet coat. The air was thick and smelled of something between rust and pine, alien pollen from the canopy flowers, our medic Rays told me. She'd done a prior survey tour in the system. The light came down in broken columns through the triple canopy, green, gold, and muted, and nothing moved that I could see. That bothered me from the first step. A jungle that size, that dense, should have been full of noise, bird equivalents, insect swarms, the small hidden things that fill every ecological niche when a world has had 1 billion years to figure out how to use its real estate. Vethara IV had all of those things. I'd read the survey reports on the transit. But in the 2 kilometers we walked from the insertion point toward the courier wreck, we heard almost nothing. The canopy was silent. Whatever lived in it had gone quiet. Rays noticed too. She walked closer to me for the last half kilometer without saying why. We found the courier before we found anything else wrong, and that set the sequence of the day. The vessel had come down hard in a creek bed, nose buried, tail section sheared off by a ridge of exposed rock, hull breached in 3 places. It had been on the ground long enough for the local moss to start working its way into the cracks. Longer than 12 hours. Longer, I thought, than the brief had accounted for. Mac went in first. Corporal Nathaniel Mac, point man and the best room clearer I'd worked with in 15 years of service. He was back out in 90 seconds, and his face told me before his words did. "Nobody home," he said. "Nobody ever was. Cargo's been offloaded, looks deliberate, not crash damage. And there's something else." Something else was a rank of skulls mounted on the interior bulkhead above the navigation console. Not human skulls, I want to be clear about that, though at the time it wasn't much comfort. They were Keth. 3 of them, the bony ridges above the eye sockets still showing the pale iridescence that Keth physiology produces in life. They'd been cleaned, arranged with a precision that had nothing accidental in it. A message left by something that understood symbolic communication and wanted to be understood. Dylan looked at the skulls for a long time. Then he looked at his handheld, and I watched his jaw tighten in the way jaws tighten when a plan stops holding water. "Change of mission," he said. I put my hand on his arm. "Start from the truth this time." He did, to his credit. There was no diplomatic courier. The Accord negotiations had broken down 6 weeks prior, over a dispute about hunting rights in contested systems. The Keth Dominion's ruling Varath caste had demanded formal recognition of their claim to take armed prey in any system where their territorial markers had been placed before human arrival. The Colonial Directorate had refused. The Varath's response had been to dispatch a hunting party to Vethara IV. A single Varath of the Exemplar caste, the highest tier of their hunter class, along with a retinue. Standard Varath signaling behavior when they wanted to communicate something too important to be said in words. Our mission, the actual mission, was to make contact, not the diplomatic kind, the other kind. The Directorate strategists had decided that the best response to a Varath territorial declaration was to demonstrate that humans weren't viable prey. We were the demonstration. 9 armed soldiers, inserted into the Varath's declared hunting ground, tasked with locating and killing the Exemplar before it killed us. They'd packaged it as a recovery mission, because they knew no combat team would volunteer for what it actually was. Blaine said something I won't repeat here. Poncho sat down on a rock and stared at the creek. Billy, our scout, Corporal Willem Sykes, who'd grown up on an agricultural colony and carried himself with the quiet economy of someone who'd spent his childhood reading land instead of maps. Billy just turned and looked at the tree line. He stood there for a long time looking and didn't say a word. I didn't feel anger then. I've examined that over the years. What I felt was something closer to clarity. The math had always been the math. Now I knew what numbers I was working with. "All right," I said. "Dylan, you're with Mac. Blaine, Poncho, take the left flank from here to the ridgeline and set eyes on the canopy above us. Raise, Sykes, Hawkins, with me. We move north. Anything moves in this jungle that isn't us, I want to know about it before it knows about us." "And if it already knows?" Hawkins asked. He was young, our youngest, a signals specialist barely 2 years out of the training cohort, smart enough to ask the right questions, not yet experienced enough to know when not to. "Then we make it expensive," I said. We moved north. The first sign wasn't visual. It was olfactory, a smell that had no business being in a jungle, a sharp, faintly chemical scent that Rays identified immediately as cauterized protein, something burning at very high temperature. We found the source 400 meters into the canopy, in a small clearing where 3 Keth scouts had been on station. They'd been armed. They'd been alert. Their defensive arrangement around the clearing was professional, overlapping fields of fire, good ground. It hadn't mattered. The plasma burns on the tree trunks weren't from Keth weapons. They were from something that fired from above, from a position in the canopy that our most careful scan of the branches couldn't locate. Whatever had done it had been firing downward at a steep angle, and had relocated before the last Keth scout had finished falling. Billy looked at the clearing for a long moment. He crouched, touched the ground, lifted his fingers and examined what came away on them. Then he stood and looked at me. "It was watching them first," he said. "It let them settle in, it waited." "How long?" "Hours, maybe more." He looked up at the canopy. "It's patient." I called Blaine and Poncho back in. I told Mac to burn the communications relay he'd been carrying. If the Varath was monitoring signal frequencies, and I had to assume it was, we'd already been loud enough. From here we went dark. Hand signals, direct line of sight, and the kind of noise discipline that you don't achieve through training alone, only through sufficient fear. We moved as a unit after that, consolidated, which was probably a mistake in retrospect. A dispersed formation gives a hunter more problems, more decisions. But a dispersed formation in canopy that dense, with team members who couldn't see each other through the foliage, felt like volunteering to be picked off one by one. I chose the mistake that let me keep eyes on my people. For 3 hours nothing happened. That was its own kind of pressure. The jungle stayed silent around us. We moved steadily north, angling toward the ridgeline that Dylan's corrected intel suggested was the Varath's primary operational zone. The light shifted and deepened as the afternoon wore on, the gold going out of it and the green becoming something darker, almost submarine. Hawkins was the first. He was walking 6 meters behind me, near enough that I heard the single sharp exhalation, not a cry, not a word, just the sound a body makes when the air goes out of it all at once. I turned in time to see him lifted, not from the ground but already 4 meters up, hauled into the canopy by something I could not resolve into a shape no matter how hard I looked. There was a shimmer, a distortion of the light around the branches, and then the branches closed and Hawkins was gone. We opened fire into the canopy for 12 seconds, a full 12 seconds of sustained fire from 7 weapons, and we hit nothing. I know because when the branches finally settled and the leaves stopped falling, nothing came down, nothing at all. I ordered a ceasefire. The silence after it was the loudest thing I'd heard in years. "It can bend light," Reyes said. Her voice was steady. I was grateful for that. "Or scatter it," Max said. "Some kind of active camouflage, thermal, maybe selective spectrum." "Billy," I said. He was already crouching, reading the ground. "It came down from the north, used the tree trunks for cover on the approach, went back up on the east side. It's heavier than it looks. The branch flex pattern," he stopped. "It's big, Sarge, really big." "How big?" He held his hand about 1/2 meter above his own head. "The Varath Exemplar class. I'd read the intelligence assessments. 7 feet at the shoulder, bilateral symmetry, forelimbs adapted for both manipulation and combat, with a secondary skeletal structure beneath the primary musculature that served as natural armor against kinetic impact. The Varath had been the apex predator of their homeworld for 3 million years before they developed technology. They hadn't replaced their biology with their machines. They'd added to it. "It took Hawkins and it left," Pancho said. Why not hit all of us?" "Because it's not trying to kill us," Blaine said. He said it flatly as a statement, not a question. Blaine had done 3 combat tours on worlds with confirmed hostile xeno contact. He understood what he was looking at. "It's hunting us. There's a difference." He was right, and understanding the difference was the thing that eventually kept me alive. A hunter isn't trying to eliminate a threat. A hunter is engaged in a process, one that has its own internal logic, its own packing, its own satisfaction. The Varath Exemplar wasn't trying to neutralize a military unit. It was conducting a hunt. That meant it would take us at its own pace, in its own chosen sequence, in whatever manner affirmed its sense of the process. It would not rush. It would not panic. It would not make mistakes born from emotion. What it would do was be patient and methodical and absolutely confident that we could not stop it. I spent the next hour trying to use that against it. We rigged a kill zone in a natural funnel between 2 rock formations north of our current position, a 70-meter channel where the canopy thinned enough that anything moving overhead would have to make a choice between exposure and a longer route around. We seeded it with every tripwire, pressure plate, and shape charge rig our engineers were carrying. Pancho was an artist with demolition materials. What he assembled in that channel in 45 minutes was something that could have stopped a light armored vehicle. Dylan wanted to use Anna as bait. Anna was the Keth liaison officer we'd found hiding in a maintenance crawlspace of the courier wreck. The one detail Dylan had omitted from his revised brief, perhaps because it complicated the story he was telling himself about the mission. She was young, perhaps 30 by Keth reckoning, and she hadn't said a word since we pulled her out of the crawlspace, just watched us with large, flat eyes that processed everything with the careful intensity of a person who has decided that survival requires complete information. She understood enough of our language to follow orders. I refused, not on humanitarian grounds, though those existed, on practical ones. The Varath had already scanned and categorized every member of our party. Offering it something unusual would signal that we'd changed tactics, and a hunter that's sophisticated would read the signal before it walked into the trap. Instead, I walked into the channel myself, alone, visibly armed, moving at a pace just slow enough to suggest I was searching for something rather than waiting. I walked it twice. The second time, I left my primary weapon propped against a rock at the far end and walked back to cover with only my sidearm. We waited. It came from directly above, not through the channel at all, from the canopy over the rock formation on the western side where the coverage was denser. It had seen the channel. It had evaluated the channel. It had gone around. The tripwires detonated anyway, a second apart, two of them catching whatever wash of energy its camouflage system was projecting. Through my scope, I caught the outline of it in the blast light, enormous, moving with a fluidity that had nothing mechanical in it, something that lived in its body the way a wolf lives in its body, completely and without apology. It was gone before the third charge fired. Blaine was dead when we found him. He'd been at the far edge of the kill zone to cover my exit, and the Varath had simply taken him as it passed. The wound was cauterized. A shoulder-mounted weapon, something that fired concentrated plasma in a tight beam, so precise it had gone through Blaine between two ribs without disturbing either. A surgical strike, not cruelty, craft. Pancho pulled Blaine's dog tags and didn't say anything. Neither did I. We moved again. Moving was the only thing I could offer my remaining people, the illusion that location mattered, that if we kept changing position, we were changing our situation. Maybe it wasn't entirely illusion. Movement generated information, and information was the only weapon I had left that I hadn't already fired. I want to be honest about what those hours felt like, because the after-action reports tend toward the clinical, and the clinical strips out the thing you most need to understand if you want to know what actually happened on Vethara IV. What it felt like was this, like being in water that was slightly deeper than you'd expected, and slightly colder, and the shore was slightly farther away than your last look at it had suggested. Not the clean terror of a firefight, which arrives and departs and leaves you shaking but alive in the moment's aftermath. This was slower. This was the accumulative weight of a situation that kept getting worse in small increments, each one survivable on its own, the sum of them something else entirely. I had been in combat. I had been in bad combat, the kind where the noise alone can break a person who isn't prepared for it, the kind that leaves marks you carry in your bones for decades. I had never been hunted. There is a distinction. In combat you are active, responding, making decisions at the speed of threat. Being hunted is different. Being hunted means the decision schedule belongs to something else, and your job is to survive the intervals between its choices. It is a profoundly passive situation for a soldier, and passivity of that kind, sustained over hours, works on a person in ways that direct violence does not. Pancho hadn't said anything since we'd found Blaine. He was functional, he was moving, covering his assigned sectors, doing the work, but whatever mechanism normally kept Pancho's commentary running continuously had gone quiet. And the silence where his voice usually was felt like its own kind of wound. I kept him close to me, not because I thought proximity would save him, because I didn't want to be alone with my own thoughts, and Pancho's silence was still company of a kind. What I was learning, under the terror and the grief and the growing understanding of how badly outmatched we were, was this: the Varath had limits. They were not insurmountable limits, but they were limits. Its camouflage system was optical and thermal, not acoustic. Billy had demonstrated that by lying flat in a stream bed with his ear to the water and listening to the root vibrations of the trees, he could track the creature's movement through the canopy by the displacement patterns it created in the root system. Not precisely enough to aim by, precisely enough to know direction and general distance. Its thermal vision could not distinguish a human body temperature from the ambient temperature of the jungle floor when both were the same. The mud in the creek beds was cold, barely above the surrounding soil temperature. The Varath's primary sensing system relied on differential. It hunted by contrast. No contrast, no lock. And it honored something. I'd been watching its choices, constructing a profile. It had taken Hawkins and Blaine and 2 members of Dylan's pair. Dylan himself had vanished sometime in the previous hour, and I'd stopped accounting for him, but it had not fired on anyone who wasn't carrying a weapon. Anna, unarmed, had been left alone each time. The Varath's caste system embedded what their biologists called the honor protocol. Unarmed prey was not prey. It wasn't mercy. It was a category error, as fundamental to the Varath as the distinction between food and tools. I thought about that for a long time. Mac went down in the late afternoon near the ridgeline. He'd been covering our rear, and he went quiet between one report and the next. When Reyes and I doubled back, we found his equipment arranged in a careful pile beside the path, every weapon, every piece of kit, stacked with the deliberate geometry of something making a statement. His body was gone. In 17 years of combat, I had never seen anything that disturbed me more than that pile of equipment, assembled by something non-human with something it understood as respect. The honor protocol. It had cataloged Mac as a worthy target, and it was observing its own traditions about what worthy prey deserved. Reyes and I and Billy, the 3 of us left now, made the ridgeline before dark. The ridge gave us elevation and a partial break from the canopy, enough that the sky was visible through the tree tops. Vethara IV's primary above the horizon, the distant smear of the Varath Dominion's transit station visible in the darkening sky. Help that wasn't coming. A war that hadn't started yet and might still not, depending on what happened in the next few hours. We took 10 minutes to breathe and assess. It was the first time since insertion that I'd had time to count what we had and what we didn't. 2 rifles with diminished magazines. Reyes' medical kit, most of it unused and now irrelevant. There was no injury the kit was equipped to treat, no wound to close or fracture to splint. The remaining demolition charges, which Reyes had consolidated and cataloged with the quiet efficiency that I had come to understand was her primary coping mechanism. When everything else was chaos, count the things you can count. Her count was not encouraging. What we had in abundance was information. 6 hours of contact with an adversary that, whatever else it was, had consistent patterns, and patterns could be used. I made myself think like an engineer, not like a soldier, not like a man with 6 dead colleagues and a slowly clarifying sense of his own mortality, like an engineer, which means identify the system, identify its constraints, identify where force applied at the right point yields disproportionate result. The Varath's camouflage was active and power-dependent. The honor protocol was consistent enough to be predictive. Its thermal sensing was differential, not absolute. Its hunting methodology prioritized the process over the outcome. It was conducting a ritual, not an execution. Every ritual has a shape. Every shape has an edge. How long until extraction? Reyes asked. 6 hours, I said, maybe 5. It'll take us before then. Yes. What do we do? I thought about the mud. I thought about the honor protocol. I thought about what Billy had said. It's patient, really patient. And it had been patient enough to hunt 9 armed soldiers across 20 kilometers of jungle over the course of a full day, packing itself, making choices, following its own internal logic about how this was supposed to go. Hunters think in terms of the hunt. They don't think in terms of the aftermath. They don't plan for what happens if the prey changes the nature of the game. "We stopped being prey," I said. Billy looked at me. "What does that mean?" "It means we go find it." Ray stared at me for a moment and then started checking her ammunition. That was her answer. Billy took off the equipment that rattled or reflected and started moving toward the tree line, and that was his. I stripped off my outer layer and went to the creek below the ridge. The mud there was black and cold, the consistency of engine grease, and it smelled of the mineral-heavy soil of the moon. I covered myself with it, face, hands, neck, every exposed surface. Not camouflage, not hiding. The Varath could still see me thermally once my body heat began to bleed through the mud. But it changed my profile, blurred my edges, introduced confusion into its sensor picture. Even a fraction of a second's hesitation from a 7-foot hunter with a shoulder-mounted plasma weapon was a fraction of a second I didn't otherwise have. We moved into the canopy. Billy tracked it through the roots for 20 minutes before he found its roost, a position near the crown of the ridge's tallest tree, where it had been watching us plan. It had known what we were doing. It had waited to see if we'd move toward it or away. We moved toward it. I don't know what category that put us in for the Varath. I know what it felt like from my side, like walking deliberately through a door you know closes behind you, like doing the thing you've decided to do because there is no other thing worth doing. It came down from the tree slowly, not because it was cautious, because it wanted us to see it coming. The camouflage powered down in stages, the shimmer resolving into mass and shape and then, finally, into the thing itself. 7 feet of it, and all 7 feet were moving with the absolute physical confidence of something that has never, in the entire evolutionary history of its species, had a reason to be afraid. It was wearing trophies. Skulls, mostly, threaded on what looked like woven cable, hanging from the armor plating across its chest. The armor was dark, almost organic-looking, grown rather than manufactured, some kind of biocomposite that the intelligence files suggested was partially alive, capable of limited self-repair. The face beneath the helmet was massive, the lower jaw flanked by articulated mandibles, the orbital anatomy deeply recessed behind bony ridges. The eyes, when they caught the last light, held something I still struggled to categorize. Not malice, not bloodlust, but something closer to professional attention. It was looking at us the way a master craftsman looks at a problem worth solving. The helmet came off. It removed its own helmet and held it at its side, and in doing so it was telling us something. It was telling us it didn't need the thermal sensors. It was telling us it was going to finish this with its own eyes. I had built a trap. In the 20 minutes Billy was tracking, Ray's had been working. She'd seeded the ground around the base of the ridge tree with every remaining charge we had. Wired to a single manual trigger she was now holding at 60 meters distance, behind a granite outcropping. The charges weren't shaped for directional blast. We didn't have time for that. They were packed for concussive force, buried at root depth, designed to turn the ground itself into the weapon. The Varath walked toward me, deliberate. It was hunting me personally now, the last armed human on its designated ground, and everything about its body language said it understood this to be the proper conclusion. I stood my ground and I kept its attention exactly where Ray's needed it, on me. When it was 12 meters out, I spoke to it. I don't know if it understood the words. I suspect the words didn't matter. "You came a long way," I said, "to learn what we are." It tilted its head. The mandibles moved, and I hit the emergency signal on my wrist unit, not the extraction beacon, the combat alert, which put out a burst signal on the Varath's own tracking frequency, something our signals tech had pulled from the intelligence files before Hawkins died. The creature reacted to the signal instinctively. its head snapping left toward the electronic source. Rays fired the trigger. The ground came up. Not fire, earth, roots, shattered rock, concussive force moving outward from 6 buried charge points simultaneously, a ring of destruction that caught the Varath at the center and lifted it. The bioarmor absorbed part of it. It was extraordinary material. I give the Varath Dominion's assessment of Varath technology full marks, but no armor, however sophisticated, is rated for a vertical ground burst from below. It went down. Not dead, but down on one knee, the helmet spinning away into the undergrowth. I was already moving. I had 1 charge left. 1, saved from the beginning of this, carried on the chance that I'd find a use for it that was better than any other use. It was a cutting charge, designed for breaching reinforced doors, small, precise, built to deliver maximum force in minimum space. The Varath was trying to rise when I reached it. Even damaged, even down, it was trying to rise. That I understood. That was familiar. I'd seen men do it. I'd done it myself. I placed the charge against the junction of its armor and its jaw. I held it there with one hand and looked it in the eye. What I saw in those last seconds was not what I expected. Not rage, not pain. Something that my brain, searching for a category, kept returning to the word recognition. It saw what I'd done. It understood the sequence, the trap built while it watched, the electronic feint, the charges it had not detected because it was too confident that it already knew the ground. It understood that it had made a mistake, and it understood the nature of the mistake, and somewhere in the calculus of its culture that meant something. "Now you know," I said. I detonated the charge and threw myself backward. The sound it made at the end, the sound the Varath made through whatever pain system it possessed, in whatever register its biology used for terminal distress, I will carry that sound for the rest of my life. Not as a trophy, as a weight. It was not the sound of something broken or diminished. It was the sound of something complete. The Varath's caste culture, as the xenolinguists later explained to me in one of the many sessions designed to extract meaning from what I'd experienced, has a specific concept for the conclusion of a perfect hunt. There is a word for it, untranslatable in its full register, that encompasses both the honor of the quarry and the completion of the hunter. The sound the Exemplar made was close to that word. I don't know how to explain how I knew that. I know that I did. That's the difference, I think, between what I am and what it was. It hunted for the trophy. I survived for the weight. I was 50 meters away when the wrist device on its arm began to pulse. I recognized the pattern from the intelligence files, the Varath's self-destruct protocol, activated by a failing Exemplar to deny its body to the enemy. I ran. I ran without looking back, through the dark and the root systems and the alien mud, and Rays ran ahead of me because she'd seen the pulse and she didn't need to be told. And Billy was already at the ridgeline because Billy had always understood the land better than any of us. The blast took out 200 meters of canopy and lit the Vethara night sky orange for 11 seconds. I know because I counted while I ran. The way you count things when running is the only option, and counting gives the mind something to do besides panic. We made the extraction point with 40 minutes to spare. The CDF shuttle came down hard and fast. The pilot had seen the blast from orbit and made some decisions about urgency that I was grateful for. We loaded. We lifted. I sat with my back against the shuttle's hull and felt the weight of Vethara IV's gravity release me, one slow pound at a time, as we climbed through the canopy layer and then through the cloud layer and then into the clean dark above. Rays was asleep within 5 minutes. Billy sat across from me and looked out the viewport at the moon shrinking below us and didn't speak. The inquiry started 2 weeks after we returned. It ran for 4 months. The Directorate's position, eventually, was that the mission had achieved its strategic objective. The Varath Exemplar had been neutralized, the message had been sent, and the accord negotiations had subsequently resumed with new terms that did not include hunting rights in contested human systems. 6 dead soldiers, 1 missing intelligence operative, and one traumatized Keth liaison officer in exchange for 11 months of resumed diplomacy. The inquiry's classified appendix, which I was permitted to read once and not to copy, noted that the Varath Dominion's reaction to the loss of the Exemplar had been unexpected. Not escalation, something more like recalibration. There was a word in their diplomatic communications in the weeks after Vethara IV, a word that the xenolinguistics team rendered approximately as reclassification. The Varath had reclassified humanity in their cultural taxonomy. We'd been listed previously as what the translation team called potential prey species. After Vethara IV, the classification changed. The translation of the new classification took 6 linguists 3 weeks to agree on. The best approximation they settled on was those who hunt back. I don't know if that's better or worse than what we were before. I know it's different. I know the accord held, and that humanity's systems haven't seen a Varath hunting party in the years since. I know that somewhere in the Keth Dominion's cultural records there is an account of what happened on Vethara IV, their account, told in their categories, shaped by what their honor protocol makes of what we did. I wonder sometimes what they call it. I wonder if there's a word in their language for a prey animal that builds its own trap. Reyes went back to survey work. Last I heard, she was on a long-range mission past the outer markers, cataloging worlds that humans hadn't touched yet, doing it quietly, the way she always did everything. Billy went home to his agricultural colony. He runs a grain operation now, 400 hectares on a world with a yellow sun. I got a message from him once 2 years after Vethara IV. It said only, "The canopy is quieter here." I appreciated that. I accepted a desk assignment. Combat engineering consultancy for the CDF Doctrine Group, advising on how to build things, how to breach things, how to prepare ground. Good work, honest work, the kind that doesn't require me to explain to anyone what happened on a jungle moon that most people have never heard of. Some nights I still hear the jungle, the silence of it, that particular silence, the sound of a forest that has understood something large is moving through it. I understand now why it went quiet. When the Varath moved, everything moved out of its way, not because it was loud, because it was the most dangerous thing in that ecosystem, and every creature in the canopy had evolved, over millennia, the instinct to simply become invisible when the hunter passed. What I hope the Keth Dominion's Exemplar understood, in whatever register of consciousness a creature like that possesses understanding, is that we don't have that instinct. Humans never developed the clean genetic encoding that says, when the apex predator comes, become still, become quiet, become nothing, wait for it to pass. We developed something else, something less elegant and considerably more expensive for everyone involved. When the apex predator comes, we dig in. We make the ground itself a weapon. We take losses that would break any rational calculation of acceptable cost, and we keep moving. We are not fast enough to run, not strong enough to fight clean, not quiet enough to hide for long. We are simply, stubbornly, unreasonably unwilling to accept the conclusion the universe keeps trying to hand us. I don't know if that's a virtue. I suspect it isn't entirely. But it is what we are, and Vethara IV is where the Varath Dominion found out. The mud has long since washed off, the weight hasn't. That's what you carry home from a place like that, not the win, not the survival, but the full and complete accounting of what it cost. Hawkins and Mac and Blaine, and the others whose faces I see with a clarity that has not dimmed in all the years since. They weren't advisors. They weren't a contingent. They were soldiers, and they died on ground they'd been deceived into standing on. And they held it anyway because that's what soldiers do when there's nothing left to do but hold. I held it after them. That's all, that's the whole of it. The jungle moon is still out there, circling its primary, doing what moons do. I don't know who hunts on it now, or what lives in its canopy, or whether the root systems still carry the vibrations of something enormous moving through the trees. I know that somewhere in the mud along a creek bed, buried by seasons of rain and growth. There are the remnants of a fight that changed the category a civilization put us in. I hope the mud keeps them.